see it on the cover of Forbes, you see it in the mythos of Silicon Valley, and you definitely see it in every sports movie ever made. Our culture is completely obsessed with the idea of the lone genius, the visionary CEO who single-handedly pivots the company, the maverick quarterback who puts the entire team on his back. Now, we have internalized this deeply romantic but entirely fictitious idea that greatness, and specifically leadership, is a solo act. We treat it like it's a biological trait, some rare mutation baked into the DNA of a chosen few, while the rest of us are just lucky to be caught in their gravitational pull. It is incredibly seductive. When a company experiences a massive turnaround or even a catastrophic failure, our brains desperately want a simple narrative. We want someone to blame or praise. We want to point at one person and say, they did it, they are the reason. It's clean, it's binary, and frankly, it requires zero cognitive effort. If leadership is just a magical trait inside one person's brain, then we don't have to look at the messy, chaotic web of interactions that actually produce the outcome, which is exactly what we are tearing down today. So we are going to dismantle that lone genius myth completely, because if you operate under the assumption that leadership is a solo act, you are essentially flying blind in your own career. You really are. Now, we have a stack of research today that is going to entirely rewire how you understand influence, power, and honestly, every single conversation you have at work. Now, we are diving into a foundational academic review called Leadership, a Communicative Perspective by researchers Gail Fairhurst and Stacey Connaughton, a fantastic paper. And we are fusing their theory with the engineering blueprints of E8 decision awareness model. The pairing of these two sources is what makes this deep dive so powerful. The Fairhurst and Connaughton paper maps out what we can accurately call the Relational Revolution. It pulls back the curtains on how your daily reality at work isn't just something you endure, it's something you actively co-construct every time you open your mouth. But theory is only useful if you can apply it. Right? Now, which is where the E8 framework comes in. It provides a highly tactical doctrine to stop reacting to pressure on autopilot and start making conscious, strategic choices. Let's unpack all of it. Now, let's start by looking at the ghost we are trying to bust here. For the longest time, if you wanted to study leadership, you basically just went to a psychology department. You studied the brain of the leader. Throughout the entire 20th century, the dominant lens for leadership was almost exclusively psychological, especially in Western literature. Researchers were hunting for what academics call the strong inner motor. They assumed that if you could just isolate the right combination of personality traits, cognitive styles, and inherent behaviors, you could basically bottle leadership like a formula. Now, this was the era of endless personality tests, charisma measurements, Myers-Briggs categorizations, all of it. Now, Peter Graham, a prominent scholar in this field, coined a brilliant phrase for this obsession. He called it the belief in the power of one. The belief in the power of one, that is the magazine cover right there. It's an exaggerated, almost mythological sense of agency attributed to individuals. But organizational communication scholars have been aggressively dismantling it, because the psychological model was built for a world that no longer exists. It assumed organizations were highly rational machines. Clear bureaucracies, stable markets, predictable problems, and a boss at the top pulling the levers. Basically, a 1950s factory line. I don't know anyone whose modern workday feels like a rational machine. That rational organization is extinct. A look at the reality of global markets conditions today. The hyper-entrepreneurialism, the instant disruption from new technologies, the sheer volume of data we process daily. We operate in an environment defined by extreme complexity, irrationality, and continuous change. And these aren't temporary anomalies. This is the permanent baseline. So relying on a singular hero leader to navigate a fundamentally chaotic, decentralized world, That's an architectural mismatch. It's like we've been training for a solo tennis match. You practice your serve, you hone your backhand, it's just you against the world. But then you show up to a modern office, and it's actually a massive chaotic game of multiplayer tug-of-war. The ground is muddy, the rope is slipping, people are joining and leaving your side of the rope mid-pull, and you're just trying to figure out how to generate momentum together. The tug-of-war is a much more accurate visualization because it implies interdependence. Your individual strength means very little if the person next to you pulls in the wrong direction, or just lets go entirely. Now, let me play devil's advocate for a second, especially for anyone listening, a founder or a director or just a manager with a lot of responsibility on their shoulders. Do we really throw out individual agency entirely? I mean, somebody has to sign the checks. Somebody has to make the final call when the team is deadlocked. Is the power of one completely obsolete, or is it just misunderstood? Now, we have to be precise here. The literature does not suggest that individual cognitive capacity is irrelevant. If you have a brilliant strategic mind, that matters. The shift is in how we define the phenomenon of leadership itself. Now, leadership is not something housed inside your skull. It is a phenomenon that distributes itself across time, across the task, and most importantly, across people. Now, it's a shared property of a social system. If you only look at the CEO signing the check, you are missing the hundreds of micro-interactions, the debates, the compromises, the shared understandings that actually brought the check to their desk. So if leadership isn't a personality trait, and it isn't just the authority to sign a document, what is the actual mechanism? Where does leadership live? To find it, the social sciences underwent what's known as the linguistic turn. They stopped looking exclusively at the brain and started looking at communication. But the Fairhurst and Connaughton paper makes a critical distinction here. There are two completely different ways to view communication, and most people are unfortunately stuck in the old, broken model. The old model is called the transmissional view. A famous example is the Shannon and Weaver model from 1949. They were literal engineers trying to figure out how to send telephone signals. Yes. In their view, communication is just a conduit, a plumbing pipe, if you will. You have an idea in your head, you encode it into words, you shove it down the pipe, and I decode it on the other side. It's the human equivalent of sending a fax or writing a line of code. You just type it, hit enter, and the machine executes it. Now, in that model, the words themselves don't really matter as long as the message arrives intact. Communication is just a tool to describe reality. It's a secondary variable. But the linguistic turn introduced the meaning-centered view, and this is the paradigm shift we need to grasp. In the meaning-centered view, language doesn't just mirror reality. It doesn't just describe the room you're in. Language constitutes reality. It builds the room. I know that sounds incredibly philosophical. So let's talk about how it actually plays out in, say, a Tuesday morning status meeting. The academics call this a social constructionist relational ontology. That's quite a mouthful, yes. But if you strip away the jargon, it means that reality of your workplace, the power dynamics, the trust, the urgency of the project, none of that exists out in the ether waiting to be discovered. It is built brick by brick through your interactions. You and your colleague don't just form a relationship and then communicate. You relate in the communication itself. Let me make sure this lands because it's monumental. If I say to my team, hey, great job on that pitch, I am not just transmitting data about my approval. No. The way I say it, the timing, the context, I am actively constructing our dynamic. Now, if I say it sarcastically after we lost the client, I just build a reality of hostility. If I say it sincerely after a grueling week, I build a reality of solidarity. The relationship is the communication. The words are the architecture. Scholars like Fairhurst, along with Cartwright and Rogers, argue that we have to change our foundational unit of measurement. If you want to study leadership, you don't study the individual person. You study the interact. And interact is defined as two contiguous control moves in an exchange. I make a proposal, you counter it, you ask a question, I deflect it with a joke. That pairing, that dynamic microscopic exchange, is the absolute base unit of leadership. Leadership isn't an identity, it is something that is brought off or achieved in these generative moments of interaction. But here's where it gets really interesting, because if we are constantly co-constructing reality through our interacts, the research points out that it's not just human beings in the room doing the constructing. We are sharing the space with other things. Now, this is one of the most fascinating aspects of modern organizational communication. It's championed by the Montreal School, which draws heavily on actor network theory and introduces the concept of hybrid agency. They argue that organizations aren't just groups of people, they are a plenum of agencies, a densely packed space of both human and non-human actors, like texts, machines, architecture, software, etc. The idea that a spreadsheet or a physical building has an agency sounds like science fiction, but let's ground it in historical examples. Now, take the intense, almost messianic charisma attributed to former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani, immediately following the September 11 attacks. The 20th century psychological view would say Giuliani dug deep, found a reservoir of internal heroic charisma, and projected it to lead the city, the strong inner motor at work. But the communicative perspective deconstructs that entirely. It argues that his charisma was a hybrid production, a distributed network. Yes, Giuliani the human was a crucial node, but that charisma only existed because of how he interacted with non-human agents. The devastating physical reality of Ground Zero, the megaphone he used, the specific emotion-laden speeches that were written, the television cameras broadcasting the ash-covered suits. The leadership wasn't just inside him. It emerged from the network of human navigating the material reality. It's the context creating the man. If you put Giuliani in a sterile white room on that exact same day, saying those exact same words into a void, the charisma completely evaporates. Similarly, researchers studied former Californian Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger during the massive 2007 wildfires. Now, his successful crisis management was entirely dependent on constant hybridization of non-human agents, like the helicopters, topographical maps, emergency broadcast technologies, and the physical fire itself. The leadership presence was an outcome of how he networked with those tools. The scholar Keith Krent sums this up brutally. Naked, friendless, moneyless, and technology-less leaders are unlikely to prove persuasive. Yeah. It forces a profound realization, doesn't it? When you are sitting at your laptop drafting an email to a difficult vendor or negotiating a deadline in project management software, you're not just a brain transmitting data. You, your colleagues, the tone of the email, the constraints of the software itself are actively co-constructing your organizational reality in real time. You are authoring your environment. But if we constantly authorize our environment and the environment is constantly shifting because of the market, and there are human and non-human agents flying everywhere, how on earth do we agree on what reality is? If 10 of us are building the airplane while we're flying it, how do we establish which way is up? That is the existential crisis of modern work. And it brings us to the legendary organizational theorist Carl Weick, who developed a concept called sensemaking. Sensemaking is the psychological and communicative process that actors go through when confronted with something unexpected, uncertain, or ambiguous. It's how we literally make sense of chaos so we can take rational action. It's the process of writing the instruction manual while the machine is already turned on and making a weird noise. The research highlights two massive pillars of sensemaking: identity work and framing. Identity work answers, who am I in this specific context? And the framing answers, who are we together? And what is actually happening right now? And these aren't multiple choice questions with fixed answers. They are fluid. We negotiate them live. Let me give you two vivid examples from completely different sectors. The first one deals with identity work inside a massive religious institution. Researcher Matthew Sheep conducted a fascinating study on the internal sensemaking of the U.S. Episcopalian leaders during a period of massive institutional crisis. The church was deeply divided over the consecration of its first openly gay bishop. Talk about a crisis of identity. Half the room believes one thing is sacred, the other half believes the opposite, and they all have to remain under the same institutional roof. Now, Sheep studied how these leaders talked during this crisis. He discovered that they utilized a communication strategy called category elasticity, or stretch. Instead of locking into grid definitions, the leaders actively stretched their linguistic categories to embrace multiple conflicting and deeply ambivalent identities simultaneously. They used language to build a bridge over a paradox. They had to redefine who they were as a church in real time using words that were flexible enough to hold totally opposing viewpoints together. Just so the institution wouldn't shatter, they constructed a reality where paradox could exist, and that is a survival mechanism. But the second example shows how framing can be weaponized, and this one is much darker. This research analyzed the infamous Enron scandal. Specifically, it looked at the role of the accounting firm Arthur Andersen and how its CEO at the time, John Boredom, handled the fallout during his testimony before the U.S. Congress. When you were testifying before Congress about one of the largest corporate frauds in history, that is the ultimate uncertain, high-stakes environment. Now, how did he frame reality? He used a highly deliberate framing strategy. He didn't just walk in and issue a blanket denial, and he didn't apologize. Instead, he bombarded the congressional committee with a relentless glut of microscopic, highly technical accounting details. He drowned them in data. He spoke entirely in GAAP accounting standards and audit protocols. He basically weaponized boredom. Now, he used extreme technical density as a frame to deflect responsibility. He was actively constructing a reality for the committee when the Enron collapse wasn't a systemic failure of ethics or leadership. In his frame, it was just a highly complex, unfortunate technical glitch in the accounting matrix. By controlling the frame, he managed the meaning of the event to protect his own identity and power. Now, your reality analogy here is important. It's like waking up in the middle of a stage play where you have no idea what the script is. You have to figure out your character. That's identity work. And you have to figure out the plot. That's a framing, based entirely on the dialogue happening around you. In the Arthur Andersen case, one of the actors realizes the play is a tragedy. So they start speaking in impenetrable riddles to convince the audience that it's actually an educational documentary about tax law. Now, sense-making is the script-writing process happening live on the stage. But your analogy raises a critical danger. If reality is constructed by how we frame it, what happens when the framing is intentionally manipulated on a daily basis? Not just to cover massive corporate fraud, but manipulated in normal, everyday office environments to hide the truth of how a company is actually functioning. Now, this takes us into a branch of academia called Critical Management Studies, or CMS, and they take a very unvarnished look at how offices actually operate. CMS focuses relentlessly on power and politics. Mainstream leadership books love to talk about influence. Influence sounds positive, voluntary, and clean. CMS argues that this is a sanitized fantasy. Power is always present, and it is always a site of contestation. And one of the most vital critiques in this space comes from scholar David Collinson. He coined a term that is going to resonate deeply with anyone who has ever worked in a corporate setting: Prozac leadership. You hear that phrase and you instantly know what it feels like. A Prozac leadership is the relentless enforcement of excessive positivity by leaders. Now, it is the mandate for good vibes only. Now, it is the corporate culture where every single problem must be reframed as an opportunity, where you are told, don't bring me a problem unless you already have a solution. And crucially, where any dissent Anxiety or criticism is instantly pathologized as being negative or not being a team player. Now, I can already hear people thinking, wait, isn't an optimistic, positive leader vastly superior to a toxic, screaming boss who manages by fear? Sure, on the surface. Being a cheerleader isn't a crime, but there is a massive difference between genuine optimism and enforced positivity. Now, enforced positivity, that's Prozac leadership, is a covert form of toxicity. Think about the mechanism. If I am your boss and I decree that we only speak in positive terms, I am outlawing reality. Real work is fraught with failure, misaligned resources, and fatigue. By demanding only positive news, I am essentially subjugating it. I am forcing you to lie about the complexities on the ground just to soothe my own anxiety and maintain an illusion of control. So if the servers are literally on fire and the engineering team is running out, they can't say, "We are failing." They have to say, "We have an amazing opportunity to rebuild our infrastructure." It completely distorts the decision-making process. Now, it blinds the organization to its own flaws. From a communicative perspective, it destroys the organization's ability to manage dialectical tensions, the inherent tensions every healthy organization has. The need for central control versus local autonomy, employee consent versus employee resistance, fixed rules versus fluid adaptation. Now, these tensions are normal. They are the pulse of a living company. But Prozac leadership tries to pave over all of those tensions with a smiley face. Now, it silences the warning systems. So instead of managing the tension, pressure builds up invisibly under this veneer of toxic positivity until it inevitably snaps, causing catastrophic organizational damage. Now, that is genuinely terrifying because when you are in the environment, you think you are just keeping the peace by staying silent. You don't realize that your silence is actively participating in the delusion. So, how do we survive this? If reality is a co-constructed web and sense-making is easily manipulated and our bosses are demanding Prozac-level positivity, how do we operate without losing our minds and without just screaming into the void? This is where we pivot from diagnosing the disease to administering the cure. This is where we transition to a highly practical architectural tools of the E8 canonical framework, specifically the decision awareness model. Now, this isn't theoretical anymore. This is operational. The entire E8 doctrine rests on a single foundational premise that takes everything we just learned about the relational revolution and turns it into a personal mandate. Now, the doctrine states, communication is decision made visible. Leadership begins when reaction becomes conscious choice. Let me repeat that because it is heavy. Now, communication is decision made visible. Leadership begins when reaction becomes conscious choice. The default state of human beings is blind reaction. We are biological creatures. When we are placed under organizational pressure, a deadline, an angry client, or a manipulative boss, we don't naturally become strategic. We fall into a state of automatic reaction momentum. The E8 model identifies 5 reaction orientations that human defaults to. Think of these as the gravitational pull of your psychology under stress. There is R2 compliance, where you just yield and agree prematurely just to make the tension stop. Done that. Now there is R3 defensive, where you protect your ego by instantly generating justifications and pointing fingers. And there is R4 reactive, where you impulsively jump to action, firing off an email before you even understand the problem. And there is R5 dominant, where you use force or volume to dictate an outcome. But the blueprint dictates the most focus to one specific orientation, R1 avoidance. Because R1 avoidance is the silent killer of organizations. It is the automatic momentum, if you will, to move away from discomfort, exposure, conflict, or responsibility. Behaviorally, it manifests as silence, delaying tactics, shifting the topic, or deliberately withholding vital information. Now let's put this under a microscope. Think about the last time you were in a crucial meeting. Someone high up proposes a project timeline that you know with absolute mathematical certainty is impossible. It simply cannot be done in 3 weeks. But you look around the room, the boss is smiling, the other directors are nodding. You feel this physical drop in your stomach. Your heart rate spikes. And what do? You look down at your notebook, you nod along, and you stay completely silent. That physical sensation you just remembered, that is the R1 reaction momentum. And it is vital to understand that this is not a character flaw. You weren't a coward. This is an evolutionary automatic response. Thousands of years ago, standing up and dissenting against the leader of the tribe meant you got exiled and died of exposure. Your brain is wired to avoid the social discomfort of breaking the consensus. But in a modern office, that biological survival mechanism is the exact engine that powers Prozac leadership. When the entire room is R1 avoidance, the organization is happily marching off to a cliff because no one is willing to endure the discomfort of saying, stop. The EA blueprint was designed specifically to short-circuit this biological response. It provides the ultimate tool for breaking organizational R1 avoidance, a sequence known as the 8-function operating loop. Let's walk through this loop by staying inside that exact meeting. The boss just proposed the impossible timeline. How do we use the loop to override our biology? Function 1, the trigger. The trigger is the consequential stimulus. In this case, it is the boss saying, we ship in 3 weeks. Function 2, the reaction momentum. This is the habitual pull. The amygdala fires, the blood leaves your face, the R1 urge to shrink into your chair and stay silent is overwhelming. And this is where 99% of people lose control of the interact. Function 3, awareness. This is the E8 awareness point, the specific somatic and cognitive moment where you notice the momentum pulling you. You feel the tightness in your chest. Instead of getting into it, you observe it. And merely by noticing it, you restore a sufficient amount of choice. I love to conceptualize this as hitting the clutch in a manual transmission car. Think about it. Your raw biological emotions, that R1 panic, is the engine, and it's revving at 5,000 RPM. Now, if that engine is connected to the wheels, you are going to speed right off the cliff into silence. But when you reach that awareness point, you press the clutch. You disconnect the engine from the wheels. The engine might still be screaming, you might still be terrified inside, but your actions are no longer being driven by that fear. You are coasting, and you have bought yourself a split second to safely shift into a deliberate, conscious gear. Now, this metaphor is highly accurate to the cognitive science of play. You are shifting processing from the reactive amygdala to the strategic prefrontal cortex. Function 4, diagnosis. Now, you analyze the conversational condition. You ask yourself, what is actually happening in this room? Are people confused? Are they terrified? Is there a power play by the boss or just naive optimism? Function 5, move selection. You look at your options and choose the deliberate scope and intensity of your response. We are going to dive deep into exactly how you choose that move. Now, function 6 is execution. You release the clutch and you express the move. You actually speak. You insert a deliberate, conscious statement into the void. Function 7, effect observation. You don't just drop a bomb in the meeting and check your phone. You watch the room. You look at the boss's face. You look at your colleague's body language. You notice what changed in the reality you just co-constructed. And function 8, adaptation. Based on how the room reacted, you re-diagnose the condition and you prepare for your next move. That is the continuous operating loop of a conscious leader. Let's rewind back to that moment when the clutch is pressed in. You have awareness. You're sitting in the function 5, move selection. Your heart is pounding, but you are in control. How do you actually know what to say? How do you steer the conversation? Now, this is the genius of E8 blueprints. It gives you the E8 response compass. When you have broken the R1 avoidance, You don't just speak randomly, you choose to steer the conversation in one of four distinct navigation bearings. Bearing 1 is clarify. You steer toward clarify when the room is clouded by ambiguity. Your move is designed to define the actual issue, separate fact from interpretations, and expose hidden assumptions. If the boss says, "We need this done faster," a clarify move would be asking, "When you say faster, are we talking about cutting scope or adding headcount?" You are forcing reality into focus. Bearing 2, stabilize. This is the emergency brake. You use stabilize when the heat in the room is too high. If the interact is devolving into panic, blame, or toxicity, your move is designed to reduce the temperature. It is about restoring dignity, protecting boundaries, and preserving the cognitive capacity of the team so they can actually think. Bearing 3, advance. Advance is used when the room is spinning its wheel in endless debate. Your move is designed to push the interact towards a concrete decision, assigning clear ownership or confirm the next immediate steps. Bearing 4 is transform. Transform is the deepest one and the hardest to execute. You steer toward transform when you realize the current problem is just a symptom of a deeper, recurring negative pattern. Your move is designed to radically reframe the issue, alter that deep pattern, and construct an entirely new future possibility. Now, you have your 4 directions, but you also have to decide how hard to press the gas pedal in that direction. The compass is paired with intensity levels, ranging from 1, that is gentle, very low force, purely exploratory, all the way up to I5, which is protective. An I5 move is immediate, forceful action to protect the safety or integrity of the team. It is also paired with deliberate response scope. Now, D1 is strategic, improving the immediate task. D2 is collaborative, inviting relational integration. And D3 is transformational, changing the underlying system. But the blueprint emphasizes a golden rule when selecting your intensity: the rule of proportionality, the most critical constraint in the E8 model. Proportionality dictates that you must select the smallest legitimate move capable of improving the condition. You do not use a sledgehammer to swat a fly. You do not deploy an I5 protective move if a simple I2 clarify move will resolve the tension. Over-indexing on intensity destroys the relational trust you are trying to build. So let's put this entire machine together. Let's go back into that hypothetical meeting. It's not just an impossible timeline anymore. The meeting has actively spiraled into a toxic blame game. The VP is pointing fingers at marketing. Marketing is blaming engineering. Voices are being raised. The classical biological R1 avoidance response is to sink as low as in your chair as humanly possible. Stare at your shoes and wait for a storm to pass, which is exactly how a toxic culture is sustained. But today, you're utilizing the 8-function loop. The trigger happens, the VP yells, you feel the reaction momentum, the urge to hide, but you hit the clutch. You reach the awareness point. You breathe. You disconnect the engine. You move to diagnosis. You look at the room and realize we're not debating facts anymore. People feel attacked. The psychological safety of this room is gone. You move to move selection. You look at your mental E8 compass. You know you cannot advance to a timeline solution while everyone is panicked and defensive. A clarifying move about the budget won't stop the yelling. So you consciously select the stabilized bearing. And because voices are raised, the I1 gentle move won't cut through the noise. You need something stronger, so you select the I3, firm intensity to protect the team's boundaries. You release the clutch into the execution phase. You speak up, projecting calm, authority, and say, let's pause. We're not going to solve this timeline by assigning blame right now. The pressure is high, but we need to stop dissecting who failed and start looking at the process bottleneck. Boom! You have just executed a precise, conscious control move. Think about what you just achieved from a communicative perspective. You halted the toxic spiral. You disrupted the Prozac leadership culture that might have otherwise demanded everyone just smile and push through. You completely changed the trajectory of the interact. You actively co-constructed a new, safer reality for everyone in the room. And it didn't require you to be a CEO. It didn't require you to have some mythical lone genius DNA. It just required you to master your own reactions. It takes leadership out of the realm of inherent identity and place it firmly in the realm of observable, microscopic practice. Leadership is a capability you deploy in the moment. So, what an absolutely massive journey we have been on. Let's synthesize the ground we've covered because it changes everything. We started by tearing down the illusion of power one, the outdated idea that leadership is a sole psychological trait. We embraced the relational revolution. We accepted the profound reality that our organizational environment isn't fixed. It is actively, continuously co-constructed in every single communicative interact between human and non-human agents. We looked at Carl Week's Sensemaking, understanding how we use identity work and framing to write the script of reality while we are standing on the stage. And we confronted the deeply destructive nature of Prozac leadership, how enforced positivity is actually a weapon used to outlaw reality and silence vital organizational tensions. And finally, we armored ourselves with the decision awareness model. We learned the mechanics of the 8-function operating loop. We learned how to recognize our biological R1 avoidance, hit the clutch of awareness, diagnose the room, and use the response compass to steer the reality of the room toward clarity, stability, advancement, or transformation. It is the ultimate tool for turning blind reaction into conscious choice. Every single conversation you step into today, every Slack message you type, every tense Zoom meeting you log into is an opportunity to practice this loop. Leadership is no longer a title you wait to be anointed with. It is an orchestration capability available to you right now in every moment of pressure. It is entirely about how you choose to show up to the interact. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. We talked extensively about how the Montreal School views communication as a network, a plenum of agencies that include both human and non-human actors like text, architecture, and technology. And we know that the E8 operating loop begins with a trigger from the environment, the stimulus that starts the momentum. So consider this reality we are rapidly accelerating toward. What happens as our primary daily interacts increasingly take place with or are heavily mediated by artificial intelligence algorithms? How do you apply the E8 response compass when the trigger momentum, the specific stimulus making you feel anxious or compliant or avoidant, isn't coming from a stressed out human boss, but is being algorithmically generated by a platform designed specifically to keep you in a perpetual state of biological reaction? How do you co-construct reality with a non-human agent that doesn't share your ontology? It is a complex frontier to mull over as you navigate your digital and physical workspaces. Leadership begins when reaction becomes conscious choice, not when you get promoted, not when you have the corner office, not when you have the loudest voice or the most impressive title. It begins in the fraction of a second between the trigger and the response, when you reach for the clutch instead of letting biology take the wheel. Every conversation is a construction site. Every word is a brick. The question is, what are you building? That is the exact kind of question that will keep me staring at the ceiling tonight, but in the best possible way. Keep hitting the clutch, and I will see you next time.
I wonder, you get in my I wonder, I am getting your way. We're living a love life, I say. I don't wanna lose what I have. Life puts the line and you have to decide.